Hello to all the debt warriors listening, and welcome back to another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. I'm your host, Katie Fata. On the podcast, we've had many episodes discussing managing your financial situation, but what if you didn't have access to the resources you need to maintain your financial situation? People in underserved communities lack basic financial resources. This leads to many people not being served by banking institutions or unbanked. In fact, over 6% of U.S. households, or 14.1 million American adults, are unbanked. The goal of financial inclusion is to help these Americans who lack access to banks and other financial resources. Financial inclusion ensures access to financial products and services needed by vulnerable groups at an affordable cost in a transparent manner by institutional players. This is a method of offering banking and financial services to individuals in underserved communities. Financial inclusion strives to help people in underserved communities have access to the resources and knowledge they need to become financially successful individuals. Today's episode will be discussing achieving financial inclusion. I'll be joined by Ken Baker, one of Navicore Solutions community engagement managers. Ken is an important guest for today's topic because he is focused on developing new partnerships for Navicore Solutions and programs for underserved communities throughout the country. Ken and I will be discussing financial problems underserved communities face, all aspects of financial inclusion, how financial inclusion can be achieved, and much more. Now, let's get to my interview with Ken. Hi, Ken. Thanks for being on the podcast today.
Hey there. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So you're new to Navicore. You're one of our new community engagement managers, and I know you were brought on to make new partnerships for Navicore and programs for underserved communities. So I thought you'd be a great guest to have on to talk about financial inclusion.
All right. Thank you. Yes,
So,
indeed.
yeah. So to get started, I guess what communities are the most affected by lack of financial education, and why do these communities not have the financial education they might need?
Right. Yeah. So, these will be the communities that are considered vulnerable, disenfranchised, underserved. There's so many terms and labels you can use to describe these types of cities, which is ironic because a lot of these communities where financial education was once part of everyday living. So when you look at some of the history behind how did we get to this place, we'll kind of give you the answer a little bit about, why is it not there or the lack of. So depending where you live, I'm sure there's a different reason for each city or state or what happened in particular, or why it's no longer available, or it may be available but overshadowed by other priorities and needs. Also there's been some dramatic changes within the past 50 years that that make the way that we handle money differently. We don't handle it the same way we did 50 years ago. Financial education started at home. This is by our mothers, grandparents, in the schools and so forth. And it was just, I think one of the big changes in financial education was the introductory of credit, which was a concept that started in, I think, the late 80s. But before then, credit was based on your character, socioeconomic status, networks. So anyway, a lot of those things have changed. And so when you look at financial education, it's no longer the way it used to be. And there's a gap of from that point into now. But one of the things that stood out, talking to, different generations, my mom and other folks in the community, the introduction of technology, and we could talk about that later, but, before, we would, financial education, you use money, there was tangible. Now, in order to operate a lot of your finances, you have to learn technology, in the 21st century. And so it's like you have this dual kind of thing happening, to that makes things a little bit more challenging. And, during the time where, we're not going to get into like, hey, we had a recession, businesses leaving the certain communities, hefty unemployment, single parent households, all these things impact, and which made these thriving, close knit communities vulnerable.
Mm.
So, again, I guess some of the points to draw out to say why they're no longer exist. One, they may still be there, but they're not prioritized. They could be overshadowed by other needs. Um, Not knowing that these services are available, the lack of publicizing and marketing, which is a form of access to education, social media. So it's funny, like when we talk about getting information out there, you know, everybody's go-to is social media.
Right.
However, what if I don't use it? What if I'm talking to, a demographic that listens to the radio, get their information from the news, or don't consider social media a reliable source? So, not to be long, but that's pretty much the gist of what I've discovered of some of the reasons why it may be there, but overshadowed for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think the point you brought up about the financial education being a priority is such a good point to bring up, because there could be other things going on. So they're like, why do we need to even think about financial education?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So that
Yeah.
even could be considered a barrier of financial inclusion. So what are some barriers to financial services that people in underserved communities face?
Yeah. So I look at that in two different parts, right? So you have what I call the more concrete or tangible barriers, and then you have barriers that are like limited beliefs mindset. Now let me explain. So I would consider, again, tangible barrier is, hey, if my means of transportation is through a bus route and the services that I need are not on a bus line, I'm not going to get services. So that would be more of a tangible barrier. Or, hey, I work in a house, in my household, I have a lack of childcare, or my job is not within the hours that these services are accessible. I'm not going to receive services. So, those would be more of a tangible, time restraints. Now, limited beliefs is a different category. This is like, this, for example, the stigma around attached to not knowing how to manage your money, right? And feeling like you're going to be looked down upon, or feelings of being judged. You'll hear phrases like, hey, I should know this. And it results in shame and embarrassment. And there's quite a few folks, and even listening to some of the counselor sessions and the calls, you would hear, there's a reluctance or the tone shift in like language that shows I'm embarrassed. I really don't want to talk about this. So those are some of the barriers that are more, I would say, around limiting beliefs. And then you have like, hey, finding out how bad you're really doing. No one really wants to, when I remember when I first started looking at budgets, and the first time I did a budget, it did something to me. Seeing that, how am I living? What? So I could imagine for others who's just like, hey, I don't want to see that right now. I'm not in a place to face that, reality. And, there's just others would be, unpleasant encounters with providers, and you may have someone who you're working with, and it just wasn't a pleasant experience. Being rejected on loans. There's anxiety around some of this stuff, so it's pretty, pretty hard. And also, it's funny when you look at communities, there's a sense of it's a community where if your community and your financial education is tied together, and you have some beliefs that, hey, if my financial education and me evolving, I will leave others behind.
Mm.
And so that's a whole nother category of feeling like, hey, this new information is going to take me away. And I don't feel connected anymore because now that I'm operating differently. So again, you can cut me off anytime. I'm just
No, go ahead.
yeah. So
No, that's such an interesting point too about leaving the others behind because it is like, who is going to be that one to make the change? Saying,
right.
like, that one person could help the others in the community. But that is an interesting point to make. So I
Yeah,
think, you talk about like tangible barriers, and I think another tangible barrier could be kind of lack of access, maybe to some
definitely.
financial, financial resources and everything. And one of that could be lack of access to something like a bank.
Yeah.
So what does it mean to be unbanked?
So my definition of
Go ahead.
is that, just choosing a non-traditional alternative to having a bank
Mhm.
account. That's, my grandfather was unbanked, but my grandmother had a bank account. And his was based around trust, and he was the shoebox person and hid money in his sock drawer. And, even when he passed away, it was interesting finding all these stashes of money and lottery tickets,
Mhm.
stuffed away. But, the folks who choose any alternative other than having a bank account.
Right. I feel like
Mhm.
that is actually similar to my grandpa. I feel like he's the lottery tickets. That's so similar to mine. But
Mm.
you bring up an interesting point about the grandparents. So, do you think there's a difference about our grandparents being unbanked rather than maybe younger generations today who are unbanked?
Yeah, definitely. So personal experiences and also just, having chats with others. There was a time where we had our community banks, and this is before the big banks came through. And
Yes.
you would know the bank teller would know your name, would know your family. It was a common practice to go to the bank during the week, and there were these paper receipts and what do you call those things? Balancing checkbooks. Like,
Mhm.
this was
Yeah.
counting money was physical. It was a very physical practice, and the way that my grandparents lived, comparison to, say, hey, my daughter,
Mhm.
um, is night and day.
Right.
Needs are different. And so for her, she has a bank. However, she uses, and I'm pretty sure I'm using her as a, um, just talk about that particular
Mhm.
generation. She's 21,
Mhm.
and actually she's older than that. Oops. So, but what does she have? Oh, she uses Cash App,
Oh,
and
yeah. Okay.
that
Yeah.
is more kind of the thing than her accessing and using, traditional bank accounts. So, and of course, they're more tech savvy now than they were
Right.
then. Going
Right.
back to the original change in education is, hey, you're also learning. There wasn't the technology then is not the technology we have now. So it's navigating is differently.
Yeah, that there are definitely a lot of different apps out there now that can help that younger generation to with their money, but it's not the same as having a traditional bank account. So what are the difficulties involved with being unbanked and not having that traditional bank account?
Oh yeah, there's quite a few. Well, first off, having a bank during that, going back to the original of my grandparents, there was a relationship there. You knew it was part of the community. Having these central businesses within the community was just how it was. But some of the difficulties, right, involved with that, to name a few, is you have increased. Hacks and risk of security breaches. You pay more interest charges with these other means. I'm not going to, put any companies out there, but when I look at how much you're paying just for them to hold your money, it's ridiculous. And in charging you to use your money, it's just out of this world. Getting a money order, it's expensive to go that route when a bank account would allow you to make transactions at little to no cost.
Right.
It's difficult to authenticate bank statements if you're trying to, like, get a home, or
Right.
you want to finance a car. And you can't pay credit with credit. So that's another thing. It's harder to plan for emergencies. You know, just imagine being in a situation where you are out of town and you need access to your money, or something happens and to the house and you have money stashed in places, or you're using other situations, and it makes it difficult than having an institution that's secure that can help you manage that with insurance to it.
Mhm.
So those are some, of course, receiving loans and uh, developing credit, student loans, stimulus checks. That was a big one. I remember,
Mhm.
I think we talked about it too
Mhm.
previously, was, the folks who weren't able to get stimulus checks on time rapidly because they didn't have a bank account.
Right.
And not only was you didn't get it rapidly, but now you're open to identity theft, you're open to someone taking your, theft, all of that is just,
Yeah.
open.
Yeah, I definitely thought that was a great point about the stimulus checks because, without that traditional bank account, you were just relying on it coming in the mail. And sometimes the
Yeah,
mail cannot be trusted. So
right.
that was a great
Exactly.
point to bring up.
Yeah.
And yeah, so being unbanked ties back into financial inclusion because, some people aren't banked because of the fact that they don't have access to banks. So I guess
Right,
to
right.
to bring it back to financial inclusion, what is financial inclusion and why does it matter?
Mm, wow. So, financial inclusion is key because it's a collaborative effort of all stakeholders invested, and a shared resource. And you can't, everything's it's interesting how everything's connected. You have the housing is connected. You have the local markets are connected. You have the retail stores. You have just so many things. The police officers. Everything's connected, and all parties must be at the table. When you talk about inclusion, you have so many diverse groups who live in these communities
Mhm.
who need to be a part of this conversation. And, that's, again, we'll talk about later who should be at the table, but inclusion is vital to us being able to thrive. And it's also being invited to the table. I think that's really important.
Right.
When we talk about inclusion, being invited to the table. It's having access. It's making accommodations and making room for differences. It's diversity, and it's what matters. I think that we all seen our fair share of exclusion, of not being at the table, and I think we're overdue for change. And it matters because we're all connected. And so it enhances our ability to solve problems as well, and that if everyone does a little, there's no big burden on one institution or one group to carry the weight load.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, definitely for sure. It would seem easy to just have everyone do a little, but it's definitely harder than it it would appear to be. So what are
yeah.
some challenges of financial inclusion?
Right. So yeah, I would echo just having the right people at the table. From the residents, employers need to be at the table of an inclusion, businesses, educators, institutions, public and private services. All of these are who are impacted directly by our decisions. And sometimes I think we don't see that. We look at ourselves as very independent. We look at ourselves as separate from our community, but not realizing how impactful that is. If my neighbor hurts, I hurt. If he's unable to take care of certain things and the property value goes down, that affects me. So that's those things are important, and being able to meet people where they are, I think, is really important when you talk about inclusion, and especially dealing with diverse backgrounds and experiences. I would also say working with the willing is really important when you talk about inclusion, because the harsh reality is that not everyone wants to be included. and being okay with that. However, an invitation should always be there.
Yeah, that's such a good point. So, what are some goals of financial inclusion, objectives or goals?
Well, I can say, and I can speak for, I guess, some of my personal goals and goals that I have chat
Yeah.
chats with others who are like-minded is making impactful connections. And I think that's important. We're cultivating the soil. Sometimes it's really just putting the information, just giving you the information, and the connections sometimes has to be over the content. It may take more time for me to build a connection with you,
Uh-huh.
and in order for you even to receive what I have to offer. So I think that's important in some cases. Providing information that leaves the listener with the ability to make, well-informed choices, even if they don't use it. It's just now you have more information to where, hey, look, you have a choice where before you really didn't see any other options. And so now you're in a position to make these choices with more information. I think that's a good objective. I think also changing the narrative, to reduce some of the barriers and limited thinking. If I have this, mindset that came from my friends, family, whoever, and which limits my belief to move forward, I can't go anywhere. And so we can play a small role and just help someone changing the mindsets behind that. I think that releases some of the tension around some of the barriers and objectives, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah, and introducing this as a lifestyle versus a concept.
Oh,
A lot of times we talk about different concepts and approaches, but this is vital to our well-being. It's a lifestyle change.
yeah. No, that's such a good point. And I like how you were saying how, you want to provide information to people, that even if they don't take it, at least you've provided it. So it's at
Yeah.
their willing. And I think that could start with, providing financial literacy to those underserved communities. So how can financial literacy help those in underserved communities if they decide to use the resources that are provided?
So, wow. It helps, underserved communities with preparedness and being proactive versus being reactive. And I think that's really key. A lot of times we come from a place of, hey, I didn't know this could happen, and I'm reacting to a situation which has actually put me into a worse. And now I'm worse off. I remember when, so I'm going to put myself out there. I tampered with the payday loans back in like my early college years, and I needed some cash, and I was strapped, and some things had happened. And I said, and so someone told me about these payday loans, and you can get this amount of cash, and so I was reactive, as into, I was in a situation that I thought was, I needed to have access to these funds immediately, but I was being reactive because it actually put me in a worse situation. But if I had the information that I needed about, financial education and how to plan for emergencies, I would have been in a more proactive state. I believe. So I think it's important, there. Also, we've seen the effects of natural disasters, right? And having this situation um, happen with COVID, and it impacts having the proper financial education impacts a community's recovery, and access to financial literacy can increase community resiliency. So a lot of our communities are still suffering from previous disasters that happened, um, and the resiliency, I believe, with some of the local situations that I'm hearing, could have been resolved, or could have been, recovery time could have been shortened if everyone was on the same page and had the proper information about how to come out of that particular situation.
Yeah, definitely. Financial literacy can definitely make people more proactive. That was such a great point to bring up because if they had the information about emergency funds, and they probably would have one, and then they wouldn't have to react the way they do. So that's such a
Yeah.
great point. And we have a ton of information on the site about emergency funds. So I'll put that in the description of this podcast as well.
Yeah.
So earlier we kind of touched on technology and how it plays a role in financial education and especially nowadays. So, what role do you think technology plays in financial inclusion?
Huge. Actually, before I get to that, I want to,
Hmm.
there's a point I want to make, which
Go ahead.
is, I understanding how holistic financial education is. And I think people don't realize that it's connected to your physical health and your mental health. And, you understanding and being able to budget and manage funds differently, you can reallocate some of the funds to things that are more beneficial to you. Even something as simple as not eating out as much, right? So now you're cooking your food so you're healthier.
Yeah.
But all of this is connected. And, seeing that gives it more value that this is why I need to do this because this is connected to much more than just having extra income.
Right.
But going back to your your last question.
No problem.
Yeah, so yeah, technology, it makes a difference. This is the world that we live in
Hmm.
and it makes information readily available at our fingertips. I mean, not to be cliche, but it's pretty much what it is. If you have a cell phone, and going back to like looking at comparing my grandparents to where
Right.
we are now, you could not have this information. You had to
Right.
go get it, and now you don't have to leave your home
Right.
if you don't have the means to transportation and you need to get something or you need to make a payment or you can do it from your household. So that's very important. And getting the information to you, and that goes into like marketing, getting that information to you, using social media. These are some really great it's almost limitless of what you can do with technology. And if the person has access to it, is so much you can do in bringing these elements together.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that could actually almost hurt people in underserved communities because you just said the word access. What if they don't even
Right.
have access to a cell phone? That's going to hinder them. That's probably,
Exactly.
so that
Yeah.
they're, yeah.
Yeah. No, the good point. And my role requires me to have also a grassroots mentality and
Mhm.
approach to some of what I do. So yes, social media, technology, but yeah, sometimes you got to go to the streets
Mhm.
and you have to go to where the people are. And that may mean putting out a flyer at the local laundromat. That may mean go to the local barber shop and having a conversation with folks there. It may mean operating outside of normal work hours just to make myself available and service available for when you are.
Right.
And so you're right. Yeah, everyone doesn't have that access. It's really important that we look at alternative and non-traditional ways also of getting out there.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
So we just talked about, the role technology plays in financial inclusion. So what about the government? What role do they play in financial
Wow.
inclusion?
Yeah. Well, of course, the government is always going to have the bigger voice. And when it comes to one, getting information to the masses, and I think that's important. If we need to get things out there to our people in a massive way, what better way than to utilize the government services that the government being on the same accord and working with these organizations to get the information out there. When you look at you know governmental programs that provide free programming and education that protects the rights of folks, that access, like having HUD available, these are some of the government programs that are essential for getting the services to the people, making them free and affordable with access, and having that holistic approach of covering various departments that you would need to get to that step, which is really important. I would also say, the government has the ability to incentivize inclusion and diversity, and which is great because, sometimes there's institutions or situations where you need a little bit more of a push.
Right.
And I think that that's important for the government to role to take on.
Yeah, HUD is definitely a great resource, a government resource that we're very familiar with at Navicore. So I'll put their information
Yeah.
in the description of this podcast as well.
Mhm.
So yeah, the government does provide specific services to help further financial inclusion, which is great. And I think it's another thing with people actually using the resources that they're provided. So I guess people will just have to take it a step further on their end to use these really helpful resources.
Correct. Yep. Hmm.
So, I guess to kind of round out financial inclusion, how can financial inclusion be achieved? And is it
Mm.
possible even?
Yeah, I know. I would, yeah, I don't think there's a cookie cutter way of
Right.
doing that because we're talking about the human element, there's relationships involved. And like I said earlier, each community has its own barriers and has its own challenges to why there's not in the lack of inclusion.
Right.
So I would say first, would be identifying the barriers that's unique to that community.
Right.
Um, and seeing what are these service gaps and identifying these service gaps. Why is it there in the first place? Listening to the people, which is really important. I think a lot of times we want to jump into something and we tend to listen aftermath, where I think listening should be at the forefront. And it will give you a foundation for how you're going to approach this situation of inclusion and how you're going to approach working with the folks that you're trying to assist. I think it's also having a common language, which is important. Uh, I remember taking a class. It was what do you call it? It was recovery and disaster response, something like that. And one of the issues they said when they looked at how what could we have done differently or better with getting information to people, to getting them to a safe place, for letting them know things were going to happen and what we needed to do um, to be more effective, was that they lacked having a common language.
Mhm.
And I think that's really important, especially working in nonprofits and even in the medical institutions. We use a lot of words and what do you call those, acronyms and things of that
Yeah.
nature. And I think it's important, to realize, let's come up with a common language so that information doesn't have to be studied, words don't have to be looked into. We're speaking a common language to everyone that we all understand. Um, so I think that's important.
Mhm.
Also, going to where the people are. I spoke about that earlier. Just
Mhm.
partnering with programs and institutions who are already providing services to the people we're trying to reach. Um, you know, uh, Inviting everyone to the party again. The power of invitation, making people feel welcome, even though they probably won't show. There's times where I had events where I would invite 40 people and only 5 would show up.
Mm.
And then there were times where, hey, I invited 15 people and 60 people show up.
Right. Mhm.
So, it's really about, taking the time to, spread the word, get the information out there, being consistent. That also helps build trust. When you want people to be included, everyone's just not going to jump in. They want to see if it works. Who are you?
Mhm.
And what do you have to offer? Can I trust you? We talked about, hey, having access to whatever it is that we're trying to get to. Um, what else? Being connected to a live person, I think, is really important, especially when you're looking for help and you're talking to a computerized automated system. That I can't stand that. So just having that availability or access, and being transparent with folks with no strings attached. And one of the challenges that I have, and I think others as well, when you're giving out free information and free services, a lot of times someone may think you're selling something, and
Right.
which we're not.
Right.
And so being able to let that be known and being transparent that this is free information. But it's funny because you have, situations where folks would pay a great deal of money for a ripoff when you
Yes.
can get the information for free.
Right.
So, but yeah, so
Yeah.
that's
No, 100%. And so I think like a lot of the times free resources could be better than paid ones, because we really just
mm,
do want to help people.
exactly,
Right.
exactly,
A
so
100%. And
yeah.
then, so I think financial inclusion can be achieved, definitely. um, are there
Mhm.
any other obstacles you think in the way of achieving financial inclusion? I know we talked about some
Yeah.
barriers, but do you think there's any like broader obstacles?
Well, systems change, and whether it's institutional or individual, anytime you're asking for change, there's going to be some resistance, and
Mhm.
it's not going to be far behind. And I think that's just the human nature and of how things work. Not to say that people are looking for, but it's a natural response, I believe, and I think. Case in point, I need to have a better diet and exercise more. But until it becomes a habit for me, or part of my lifestyle,
Right.
I'm gonna show some resistance. And so I think that's, something that we have to be patient with,
Mhm.
is understanding that, change doesn't happen
Yeah.
overnight. We didn't get there overnight. So being patient but consistent with that, and really, again, meeting people where they are, taking baby steps, to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, change is so hard for a lot of people. So
Yeah,
definitely patience. That's a great obstacle to bring up is people resisting change, especially I would think in underserved communities because things have been the same for so long. They might be
right.
skeptical of change. So that's why
Yeah,
they might be resistant to it.
exactly.
Definitely an
Exactly.
obstacle.
Yeah.
So what do you think are the effects of greater financial inclusion? Like how can it affect everyone, not just people in underserved communities?
Right. Yeah. It's again, it's holistic. If the impact, excuse me, of one person
Mhm.
can have directly impacts their family, and the family affects the culture, right? And then the culture of what's happening, it's infectious to the community, and the community is infectious to the government. So it's like when you look at the grand design, is how do we? Because that's how we got to this place. One way was it started at the family unit a lot of times, and that's the micro part of it, and then it began to expand, and now we have a culture here in these communities. So to undo some of this, or to have the greater impact, I think is also to the power of one, and realizing that that one person could be the change we need to have that effect on each and every part of our communities. There is it again, it's culture, it's government, all is intertwined. And I think that would be, the broader picture of having that greater effect, is that, we are able to get to that point.
Yeah, and in order to achieve, greater financial inclusion, I think everybody has to play a part. So
Yes,
so
yes.
how can everyone help further financial inclusion to have that, greater effect?
When you say everyone, you mean like,
Like everyday people, regular people who might feel that it doesn't affect them.
oh yeah, like, hey, look, the power of one, and knowledge is contagious. If
Right.
you don't have to be a financial guru to share good news.
Mhm.
And you're not alone. I think a lot of folks think that, and I'm guilty of this too. Sometimes it's like I tend to do things, and if I don't have the answer, oh well. But
Mhm.
no, there's services out there that you can tap into. I think it's really important to understand that. There's support behind it. I think also for individuals, practice what you preach. And I think that's, not to, again, be cliche, but
Mhm.
it's being the change you want to see in the community.
Mhm.
People tend to listen to your actions more than words, especially if it's working. So if I'm telling you, hey, you should get a bank account. Hey, let's work on our budget. Hey, these are some connections and networks that's been helpful for me to get to a particular place. And these are things that I'm doing versus I'm just talking to you, but I don't do anything I just told you about. So it has different effect. It's like your parents saying, hey, do as I say and not as I do kind of thing.
Right.
You don't want that. So yeah, I think the biggest one in addition to that is connecting with a reputable program, and whether it's a program, a mentor, a financial advisor, or a consultant, having these resources, not just for yourself, but where you can refer others to, so I think that's really important. Of course, I'm going to boast out Navicore Solutions because I learned about this organization within the past, 3 months.
Right.
And I wish I knew about it sooner. There's a plethora of resources, and it's a great starting point for anyone. If you don't know where to start, this could be a place for you to start, in addition to other, government funded or nonprofits that are out there that with no strings attached.
Right. No, that is such a great point. We definitely provide so much information. And I always try to even just tell people in my everyday life about all the information we provide. So, yeah, that's and I also just want to go back to one thing you said about practice what you preach is such a great point. And I think people definitely relate more to real life experiences. Like I can tell people all day they need an emergency fund, but then I could, maybe
Right.
if something actually happened to me where I needed
Yeah.
it and I told them, and they'd be like, oh wow, maybe I really do need one. That happened to her. So I think
Right.
it's definitely a great point to bring up. But I think with
Yeah.
that being said, I think you answered all my questions about financial inclusion and how we can achieve it and everything of that nature. So thank you for being a guest on the podcast today.
Oh, this was awesome. Please have me back. I like this. This is
Oh,
really
I would love to. I always love to have returning guests. So I'll definitely keep that in mind.
great. Great. Awesome. Thank you.
Financial inclusion is something that many people might not be aware of, but it can affect them whether they know it or not. It's important to spread the word about financial inclusion. One step that can be taken to achieve financial inclusion is providing more banking opportunities to underserved communities. Many people are unbanked because they don't have the resources they need to do so. If you're unbanked, you might not be able to make big life purchases such as buying a home. Being unbanked has also recently affected people in regards to the stimulus check. Without a bank account, people had to rely on getting the check in the mail. There are so many risks involved with mailing such a large check, and many people in underserved communities weren't able to receive the financial help that they needed. Technology also plays such a large role in finances these days, and a lot of people in underserved communities don't have the access to technology. This leaves them without the option of traditional banking or even non-traditional online banking. Financial inclusion is important to everyone, and it's possible to achieve if we can all step up and do our part. Navicore Solutions provides free financial resources that can help people better understand their financial situation. And I'll put a link to our resources in the description of this podcast so you can get that there. With that being said, that wraps up another episode of Millennial Debt Domination. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, please rate and review us there. I'll talk to you next time, Millennials, Gen Zers, and everyone else listening. Bye.